As you know, here on Test Drive, I love featuring the older luxury vehicles. And while a 2013 might not be that old, it still is something interesting to take a look at. This, my friends, is a 2013 Cadillac ATS 3.6L luxury all-wheel drive. One of the reasons why I'm excited to drive this is because it's only got 64,000 kilometers on it. Pretty little for a 10-year-old car. And second, this vehicle is listed at Disbro Cadillac here in St. Thomas, so if you're interested in buying it, reach out to me and I'll give you some more information about it. We just brought this vehicle in a couple weeks ago, bought it off the owner who just said he wasn't driving it that much anymore. And while we don't usually keep vehicles of this age on the lot, because it's in such great shape, has full service history at Cadillac, we figured this would be a great car to be able to sell. Now I'm going to go over some of the stuff that makes this vehicle interesting because I actually didn't have a chance to drive the ATS back when this was new. It uses a 3.6-liter LFX V6 engine, producing 321 horsepower and 274 pound-feet of torque, along with a 6-speed GM 6L45 hydromatic automatic transmission. 2013 was the first model year of the Alpha Touring Sedan on the new GM Alpha platform. This vehicle was designed to compete directly against the BMW 3 Series and Mercedes C-Class. In fact, the engineers at Cadillac said that they took an E46 3 Series to figure out how that vehicle handled and performed on the road, because according to them, it was the most dynamic and driver-focused 3 Series ever made. And I'd agree, we've driven a couple of them, they are nice to have. So this vehicle, even though it was based on sort of an older BMW, still has some pretty fun sporty characteristics to it, and you can tell that Cadillac did take some time to make sure that this truly competed with it. Because at the time, typical Cadillac, they thought that their larger CTS, priced in the same segment as a 3 Series, would be a pretty nice, compelling offer to somebody who was looking at a 3 Series or C-Class. But what they didn't realize is the people who were buying those cars wanted a vehicle of that size. It wasn't a plus for them that they could get the same price point in a bigger vehicle. They wanted that size segment, which is why the ATS was born. The CTS was a pretty good seller, but Cadillac did need something a little bit smaller to compete directly with the bread and butter of the German luxury brands when it came to that compact executive vehicle. Now, the GM Alpha platform is important because it underpinned this vehicle along with the CTS that we drove back in 2018 in the V format, but it's still being used today with the CT5 and CT4, and as well as the outgoing Camaro. So a number of vehicles that used this platform, and it does handle very well. It's a rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive setup. It does have some pretty good driving characteristics. It's not typical old-style Cadillac that rides like a boat. Now, as I mentioned, our vehicle here is pretty low mileage. It's pretty well equipped as well. This one's got the Diamond Black Tricoat paint on it, and it still sparkles today, even 10 years later. We've got the jet black leather interior, navigation, Bose audio, power driver seat with memory option, heated front seats with heated steering wheel, sunroof, and a backup camera. Now, I will say that the backup camera feels to be angled pretty low. That's how it came from the factory. You're looking more at the ground than you are what's behind you. And to be fair, I mean, 10 years ago, backup cameras weren't mandatory, so having one was a nice plus. And the other downside to this vehicle are the headlights. We've only got halogen projectors. I'm not sure if xenons were available. The information that I've got is a little too old now. We can't go back in time that far with the GM system I have access to, so I'm not able to see if it was an option on this first model year of the ATS, but that's the only other downside to this vehicle. Would have been nice if you could have at least had the xenons even without LED daytime running lights. Now, I had thought to compare this to my 2013 Mercedes C-Class because it's the same size segment, and it would have been pretty nice to have two black cars side by side and go over how 10-year-old luxury cars would have compared. The difference is, though, mine's got 228,000 kilometers versus 64, and mine is nowhere near as options, so it'd be a pretty unfair comparison to take both of them and pit them against each other. But I can tell you, compared to my vehicle, ATS does perform very similarly, has a very similar characteristic on the road, about as sporty, about as much power with it. I do find that it is a little harder to get into this vehicle, both in and out from the driver's seat for a guy like my size, and then the back seats, I can't get in there at all. Whereas my C-Class, it is possible, although I really don't recommend it. But overall, pretty comparable vehicles. So I would say Cadillac did a good job when looking at how to compete against the Germans. But I want to take this vehicle on the road, talk about how it performs, drives, and handles, and all of that. And then we'll come back here and talk about some of the things to look out for if you're in the market for the first and only generation Cadillac ATS. We are on the road with the Cadillac ATS. Yeah, it's a smaller car, and like I said, I never had a chance to actually drive it back when it was new, but it's nice to be able to see how it is 10 years later, because I'd say that it has certainly aged pretty well. Mostly because Cadillac doesn't change their design language a whole lot, right? If you think about it, it looks pretty similar. And if I had a Cadillac CT4 at the dealership to show you, I'd compare them side by side just so you can see. Rear end has changed quite a bit. But if you compare something like the CT5 that we did to the CTS that we did, very similar. So they've changed things up a little bit with the newest compact executive vehicle. But I'd say that this ATS looks great. You know, it's a nice Cadillac design, very sharp edges. You know, everything is kind of how you would expect a Cadillac to look, just a little bit smaller than the CTS. Really, that's what it was, right? It was a smaller version of it in every single way. Now, as I'm driving around here with my 3.6 liter V6 engine, I do find that the performance is pretty good. I've got all-wheel drive, which is nice to have. I have a couple drive modes, so currently we're in sport. We've got touring mode, which is just your everyday, it's what it starts up in. And then there is a snow mode as well, snow and ice. So it'll give you a little bit more traction and stuff during the winter, not so much acceleration, which is fine. But today we're going to be keeping it in sport mode. We do have the option to go into manual shift mode, but there's no flappy paddles, so I'm going to keep it in automatic, because let's be honest, folks, this is not a car you're going to buy to race around town. If you really want that, go get an ATS V. If you're looking for something that is fun to drive and, you know, good enough on fuel, because it hasn't been too bad overall, then this is a great option for you. Plus, you know, price point's not too bad overall, with very low mileage for the year and excellent service history. And this is a pretty nicely optioned vehicle. I'm pretty happy with it. Like I said, very much impossible if I were to have compared this to my own C-Class, just because this thing is more or less fully loaded compared to my more or less base model C-Class. But overall, it gives you a nice idea of how this thing was new and why you might want to consider this 10 years on in this world. Now, I know a couple of people I've spoken to said that they wish they had like a 2015 or 16 available, and yeah, they've made some changes with the model years 15, 16, 17, stuff like that, and you can go and research all that you want. We're going to stick specifically here to the 2013, but because it's the first generation, the first model year of the ATS, it shows us where Cadillac was 10 years ago. And we can see that this is where they were recently as well, with some of the vehicles we were driving up until like the 2020 Cadillac Escalade had a very similar interior. But I like it, it works. Drive, ride, handling, all that is very fun on this vehicle. You can give it a bit of gas. Oh, it needs to find which gear it needs to be in. There's only 6 of them, but that took a second for it to figure it out, because again, this isn't meant to be like a sports car. Well, it is. It's not really like a sports car, right? 6-speed transmission's kind of there, and the engine overall good amount of performance out of it. But you know, unless you were going for the V, like, this is going to be your daily commuter car, a typical luxury executive vehicle, which isn't meant to be doing too much performance, but still you got it where it counts. And that's how I've been enjoying this vehicle during the time that I've had it. It's not about sporting around and getting all the fuel used up that I can. It's just about cruising along. And this thing uses E85 if you wanted to. We're just putting regular fuel in here, but you do have the option of using E85 if you're out there. Maybe it'll save you a little bit at the pump. But something interesting to note about this specific engine, if you're looking for it, but I've enjoyed it. It's nice having a naturally aspirated engine, especially today where everything's going small displacement with forced induction. Gives you something a little slower, maybe a little, you know, just kind of moseying around, not going too fast, things like that. But that's no problem. That's the kind of cars that we like here on Test Drive. They don't always need to be way too fast, just a nice cruising. Now, I did mention a little bit about the suspension. This doesn't have magnetic ride control. That would be something available on the sport rear-wheel drive models. So as an all-wheel drive model, we just have a regular Cadillac ATS suspension on here. And what I find interesting compared to my C-Class is you feel the bumps more in this vehicle. Like, you notice that you've hit like a dip in the road or a break in the pavement, but it's not quite as, it's weird because it's so hard to explain, because in my C-Class you go over it and like you feel it, but you almost don't notice it, whereas here you notice it but you don't really feel it. Like, you know the car's hit something. And my wife was complaining that we were kind of getting bumped around a lot, but from my perspective, I didn't really feel like it was that bad. So just the way maybe I'm seated in the vehicle, I'm connected to the vehicle, I'm eating up those bumps along with the car. So I acknowledge that we're hitting a bump, but it's not the end of the world. And I'm not going to do too much testing in that front. Some of the roads here in St. Thomas aren't that great, but the idea is, you know, it is a sportier suspension, it is firmer. You can chuck it into the corners and give it a bit of a gas like we're going around here, and it's going to hug it pretty well, even without like sport tires on this vehicle. But you know, it is more along the lines of what you would expect from a BMW 3 Series with like the M Sport suspension. It is firmer and not quite as luxurious. Now, you can chuck it into the corner here, give it a bit of gas. Oh, it sounds good. And it's one of the things I actually was impressed about when I first fired this thing up. Despite being just a regular V6, no performance tuning to the exhaust or anything like that, it sounds pretty good. So again, not going for like the top end race car kind of experience here, but good enough for what you would want out of a daily driver like this, a older daily driver that you can enjoy and get all the luxuries and stuff without having to pay for the depreciation. Because this thing has depreciated quite a bit, but not as much as say other vehicles. Because you know, you can take a look at anything on the market today, there's not that many 10-year-old luxury vehicles in this range segment with 64,000 kilometers. Most of them are about 100, 120. If you get something lower, yeah, they'll be a little bit higher, but overall maintenance is going to be pretty high on these, whereas this, from what I've seen based on our service records, weren't that bad. Now it's fun, this little highway here, Highway 3 through St. Thomas, it's our little bypass here through the outside parts of the city. I find that this is the best place to test vehicles at the dealership, and it's also a great place to hear about the inside of the car. It is very quiet on this vehicle despite being 10 years old. The overall sound insulation on this vehicle is still very good. So if you're looking for something, again, that isn't your typical kind of vehicle, right? Because even though the ATS sold well, you don't really see a ton of them anymore. It's pretty nice. It's still got a lot of those modern feels and luxuries, and the fact that it's really quiet. There's no wind gushing through the sunroof and things like that. That was actually something that was recalled on these vehicles. The sunroofs would just open up on their own and close on their own. This one doesn't do it, but it's nice and quiet in here. And even, you know, we've got the HVAC setting set to 21 degrees, automatic, everything's going. It's nice and quiet. It's a really comfortable and enjoyable place to be, no matter what you're doing with it. I talked a little bit about the space outside. Unusable for me in the back seats, as I said. My daughter fits back there. She complains that it is smaller than it is when we're driving around in my C-Class, but again, that's sort of to be expected. I guess, you know, if you're looking for something a little bit bigger, obviously you're going to want to go with the CTS, but if you're looking for a compact executive vehicle, I still think that this is about the same size as a C-Class and a 3 Series. I'm not seeing much of a difference. It's at least up here up front. I am about in the same position I would be in my car, and I'm pretty comfortable. It's just the egress and like getting in and out of the vehicle for me being huge is a bit of a pain in the butt. But memory options, nice to have, as well as the exit mode, nice to have. Those are features that we find on modern Cadillacs that we're getting 10 years ago, which might not be a huge surprise, but it's kind of nice on the entry-level baby Cadillac from 10 years ago. Now, we are going to go over some train tracks here. I hate these train tracks. Ugh, I don't want to do it, but we have to for science. Oh, you know what? That wasn't too bad. See, that's what I'm saying. In my car, my teeth shatter. My whole body just falls apart when I go over those tracks of my car. In this thing, I knew it happened, I heard it happen, but I kind of felt it along with the car. It wasn't that bad. So it's interesting how the suspension works on this compared to my car, but it's also a newer suspension, a lot less travel on it over the last 10 years compared to mine, but not bad overall. Impressive. So when I'm personally looking for vehicles, if I wanted to buy something, I am a little bit more particular about things than most consumers. So when I looked at this when it first came in, I was obviously extremely interested because, you know, I'm working at Cadillac. It'd be nice to have one, and also it'd be nice to have some more features than I've got on my C-Class. There's really only one negative about this vehicle from my perspective. Again, a little bit more particular than most, is the headlights. Having the projector halogens is a bummer. Would have been nice if xenons were on this one. Again, I'm not sure if it was a feature that you could have gotten because everything else is here, so I just find it strange that that wouldn't have been an option. But again, on luxury vehicles, everything is required to be added onto it. But it's the only thing that takes away from the look of it, because there aren't any LED headlights or LED running lights, things like that. When you're driving along, your halogens are on. And that's the first thing I notice if I'm driving around and I see a C-Class just like mine, or a 3 Series, or an Audi A4. As soon as I see those halogens, I think, whoa, we got ourselves a base model there. And this is far from base model. It's got pretty much everything you could want. I really don't know what you could have added to this vehicle as a first model year of production for the ATS that this doesn't have, aside from headlights. So if you know a little bit more about these vehicles back when they were new, let me know in the comments below. Could you have gotten Xenons on a 2013, or was that something that they added down the road? Because aside from that, everything about this car is great. I really have enjoyed my time driving it. There's very little wrong with it. It's just the headlights for me. So as always, we will be wrapping this episode up with a quick buyer's guide on the Cadillac ATS. So we're going to be heading back to our little filming location, go over the things you need to look out for if you're in the market for a Cadillac ATS, and what we found on our research. You know, depending on who you ask, this vehicle has different sets of common problems. During my research, this 3.6 liter LFX engine didn't seem to have anything that was overly concerning. Now, if you go with a later model, you do get the LGX engine, which we drove on a number of vehicles, like the Buick Regal GS. It's a little bit more reliable than this, but I think the only major thing with this is like the timing chain. It's just a pain in the butt to actually get to it. Any of the engine-related things I saw, which weren't that big either, things like misfiring and things like that, were related to the 2-liter turbocharged engine, which was an option depending on which model year you went with. So I was always, as recommended, take a look at a mechanic, have a go over with them and make sure everything's been done to the vehicle. In this particular case, because everything was serviced at General Motors, we've got the full service history on this vehicle, which makes it a little easier for you to understand what's been done to it. A couple other things too, like the infotainment system, Cadillac Q. We've tested it on the Escalade and the CTS. Older system, but still pretty decent for the year. I mean, when you think about it, it's 10 years old. We've driven some new vehicles that feel a lot more dated than this, but there are some issues where the screens will just become unresponsive. The little touch-sensitive buttons for the HVAC controls also can cause problems. And obviously, if that stuff stops working, you're kind of in trouble. You're not going to be able to use much of your car. There's also been talk of some transmission-related issues as well. I'm not sure if it's specific to this 6-speed, because again, in later years, you could have had an 8-speed automatic, and then a 6-speed manual was offered as well. But again, something to take a look at. Now, mechanically, this vehicle comes as it is, as an all-wheel drive model. If you had the rear-wheel drive sport model, you could have gotten the magnetic ride control system, which would have been pretty nice to test out on this. I believe it was on the CTS-V that we drove, and I have driven a number of other vehicles using magnetic ride control, but even this does handle much like a sports car would, a little bit firmer on the road. We talked about that on our road test, but without magnetic ride control and without any adaptive suspension system, for the most part, this should be pretty much straightforward when it comes to reliability. Now, I did take a look online. There weren't many of these for sale. When you think about it, most Cadillac owners, a little bit elderly, so they're going to be taking care of the vehicles, but because the ATS was targeted a little bit more towards the younger crowd, it is possible that you're going to find models out there that have been beaten up. But considering this one's 10 years old and has all the service history, you should be in good shape. But as I mentioned, this vehicle is for sale, at least as of filming this. So if you're interested in it, or you want to know a little bit more about what I do, you can reach out to me directly, nlivesey@icloud.com, or send me a comment here on the video, and I will let you know more about this vehicle and if it's still available. But like I said, chances are by the time you're watching this, it has probably sold. But if you're interested in seeing what else we do here on Test Drive, I highly suggest subscribing to our channel. Give a thumbs up to what we're doing. James is over there in Montreal doing all of our new car stuff. I'm out here in southwestern Ontario trying to do as much of the older stuff as possible. So if you've got something that's old and unique, you think that it might be fun to have here on Test Drive, you can reach out to me as well. We'll see if we can set something up to get your vehicle featured on the show. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.